whole archipelago, or at least enough of it to claim they controlled the whole thing. It's always important to remember that during the imperial era, the Europeans could be a tad overzealous when it came to what they claimed to control versus what they were actually running on a day-to-day basis. Here in Canada, for example, the British and later Canadians claimed to have the entire North American Arctic under their control, even though it wasn't really until the late 20th century at best that you could say that Canada was actually exerting sovereignty over this area in any meaningful way. And thus was the case with the Spaniards and the Philippines. They claim they ran the whole thing, but it wasn't until the 19th century that they put any real effort into controlling the Muslim-dominated South, which by then had evolved its own Islamic governments, most famously the Sultanate of Sulu and the Sultanate of Maguindanao. A Muslim desire for self-government in the southern Philippines remains a big political issue to this day. But anyway, because of the weird way in which the Spanish ran their colonial empire, the Islas Filipinas were initially managed as part of Mexico, which they're actually closer to than Spain. So we had the Spanish king, and then under him was the Viceroy of Mexico, and then under him was the Governor General of the Philippines. The Philippines had somewhere around 112 Spanish Governor Generals between 1565 and 1898, starting with Miguel Lopez de Legazpi. I don't know how well remembered any of these guys are today, but at the very least, there are still a lot of things in the Philippines named after them. So you can see that there was one little break here in the long rule of the Spanish governors. In 1756, a big conflict broke out in Europe, known as the 7 Years' War, that pitted all of the various countries against each other. And one outcome of this was that Spain and England became enemies. And this resulted in a surprise British invasion of the Philippines right near the end of the war, in the fall of 1762. The Spanish were unprepared and surrendered Manila to the UK in October, which briefly put the islands under British occupation. The Spanish governor was arrested and forced to resign, and a British guy called Dawson Drake replaced him. Drake was the head of the British East India Company, which was the thing the British used to exercise their imperial might in Asia in those days. But his reign as governor of the Philippines didn't last long, and in 1763, Britain and Spain signed a peace treaty. And in 1764, after just a year and a half, the country was handed back to Spain, as it would remain for another 134 years and another 6 governor generals. That might sound like a lot of governor generals, and it was, which reflects the increasingly decaying quality of Spanish rule. In 1821, Mexico became independent from Spain, which meant that Spain now had to administer the islands directly. And this is often seen as ushering in a period where the Filipino colonial government became more bumbling and corrupt, which in turn set the stage for what was to come next. During the 19th century, Spanish rule had become more openly contested by the rise of a small but powerful Filipino middle class, many of whom had been educated in Spain. Beginning in 1896, there was a mass uprising against Spanish rule, and in April of 1897, the Filipino resistance proclaimed a rebel government headed by a guy called Emilio Aguinaldo, one of the main opposition leaders. A few months later, the Spanish paid him to go into exile. However, in 1898, the United States went to war with Spain for some reason, and in order to help mobilize resistance within the Spanish colonies, the Americans escorted Aguinaldo back into the Philippines. With American support, he proclaimed the formation of a Filipino Republic on June 12, 1898, which remains the date that the Filipinos celebrate as their Independence Day to this day. In any case, the Americans easily won their war against the worn-out Spanish Empire, and as part of their Treaty of Surrender, Spain agreed to give all of its few remaining colonies over to the United States, thereby ushering in America's relatively brief period of ruling a handful of overseas territories as a European-style imperial power. As the biggest Spanish colony, the Philippines was the one that excited Americans the most. The US president of that time, William McKinley, spoke eagerly of his desire to rule over the Filipinos, colonizing and civilizing them like a European king. When it became clear that this was America's game plan, Aguinaldo turned against the US and led a resistance campaign that the Americans declared a savage insurrection. This then led to the brutal Philippine-American War, that would last for 3 years and cost over 270,000 lives. Aguinaldo was captured by the Americans in 1901 and replaced as president of the resistance government by General Miguel Malvar, who was then captured by the Americans a few months later and forced to formally surrender his claim to government and pledge undying loyalty to the United States. There were 3 American military rulers of the islands during this period, and once the war ended, the first civilian governor, a man named William Howard Taft, was appointed. You may have heard that he would later go on to do a few other things in his life. Taft ruled until 1904 and was followed by 10 more civilian governors until the position was abolished in 1935. By then, imperialism had mostly fallen out of fashion in the US, and the administration of President Franklin Roosevelt believed that America should be preparing the Filipinos for independence. In 1935, the Philippines had their first ever presidential elections, and they were won by a guy named Manuel Quezon. The US still held considerable influence over his government, however, through the office of American High Commissioner. This was the office that had replaced the governor, although the idea was for it to eventually evolve into a more ambassador-type position. But in any case, the project came to an abrupt end in December of 1941, when the Philippines were invaded and conquered by the Empire of Japan. The American colonial authorities, along with President Quezon, fled to Washington and were replaced by a Japanese puppet government. The Japanese went through this whole song and dance about how their invasion was actually an Asian liberation and how they were going to grant the Philippines the independence they had been denied by the whites. Accordingly, in October of 1943, the Chief Justice of the Filipino Supreme Court, Jose Laurel, was installed as the first president of the Independent Republic of the Philippines. But of course, this was a huge charade, and all real power was held by General Hayashi Yoshide, the head of the Japanese military occupation. In the modern-day Philippines, the administration of Jose Laurel is remembered as this terrible government of traitors who collaborated with Japanese fascism and were thus complicit in the many terrible things that happened to the country under its 3 years of Japanese rule. The United States reinvaded the Philippines in 1944, and after the incredibly horrific Battle of Manila, one of the worst in the entire Second World War, the Japanese were dislodged and American rule was restored in March of 1945. The exiled President Quezon could not be restored, however, because he had actually died while in America. So his vice president, Sergio Osmeña, took charge as the last president under what was known as the American Commonwealth period that served as a prelude to independence. On July 4th, 1946, the United States granted the Philippines full independence. The first post-independence president was Manuel Rojas, who had been elected a couple months earlier. He had actually served in the collaboration government, but everyone just agreed to look the other way on that one. President Rojas died in office and was replaced by a Vice President Elpidio Quirino. He served for 4 years, then lost to Ramon Magsaysay. Magsaysay served for 4 years before dying in a plane crash during his campaign for re-election. Vice President Carlos Garcia took over and was elected to a 4-year term. He then lost his bid for a second term to Diosdado Macapagal, and Macapagal in turn lost his bid for a second term to Ferdinand Marcos, who in 1969 finally became the first Filipino president to actually win a second term.
Ferdinand E. Marcos ng Batak, Lalawigan ng Ilocos Norte.
But President Marcos wanted to stay in power even longer than that. In 1972, in response to what he claimed was a worsening domestic insurrection, he proclaimed martial law and suspended most basic civil liberties and democratic institutions. This is usually seen as the point in which the Filipino government officially transitioned into a dictatorship. A year later, the year that his term was supposed to end, Marcos introduced a new constitution that changed the Philippines into a parliamentary system, on the assumption that people will endure more authoritarianism through that type of government. In 1978, his party won a suspiciously gigantic landslide in the first parliamentary elections, and Marcos was elected prime minister. In 1981, the Philippines switched back to the presidential system, and Marcos was elected to a 4th term of whatever he was at that point. I mean, by then the Filipino constitution was a mess, and it was pretty clear the country's whole political system was just a big scam to keep the Marcoses in power forever. ruler. I say Marcos's because President Marcos's wife, Imelda, is often considered to be a kind of co-ruler with him during this period. He had made her a senior member of his